Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Tech London Advocates Future of Work Group, welcome to our first event of 2022. It's one of a series that will lift the lid on the issues that underpin the future of work. And today, we're discussing the world of employment law, the implications and potential bear traps for employees and employers alike. So I'll hand over to my colleague, Louise Barfield, to introduce our fabulous guest, Nicola Wallbank.
Thanks, Jan. That's a lovely introduction. Hi, everyone. I wanted to first to introduce myself. I work with Jan at the Future of Work Group, organising our events and our communications. And I'm delighted to introduce Nicola. Nicola Wallbank is a partner at a specialist employment law firm in the Thames Valley, Julian Taylor Solicitors. And as a working parent, Nicola, you know about flexibility and also those arrangements in real life and family commitments. But your clients are very diverse, I understand, and you have extensive experience of both employer and employee issues in this area. So it's going to be fascinating to pick your brain, but also pick up on some sort of topical issues as well. I think this is the first of our series of actually lifting the lid, I think, on some of the issues that we often skip over in terms of the future of work and actually the reality of what people are working with right now. So I'll kick off with something that it came up when we first met, that whole idea of the current legal framework. You know, is it creaking? Is it still quite resilient? What's happening in the world of employment law?
Yeah, well, thanks, Louise, and thanks for that introduction. It's great to be here. So the current legal framework, if we start by looking at the current legal framework for flexible working, so legally, as it stands, employees need to have been employed by the same employer for 26 weeks before they can request flexible working under the statutory flexible working regime. And what we mean by flexible working in this particular context is really any sort of working that better suits an employee. So it could be shorter hours, part-time, compressed hours, a job share, change in location to be working from home, anything that differs from the sort of contracted working arrangements. And what we're referring to here as well is a request from an employee to make a permanent change to their working arrangements. Not just a kind of, oh, for the next few weeks, I'm going to need this kind of flexibility. This is a request for a permanent contractual change. And generally, if somebody puts in that kind of request, then the employer has to consider that request and deal with it in a reasonable manner. And that basically means talking to the employee about it and taking no longer than 3 months to formally respond and get it sorted. And there's very useful ACAS guidance on how to handle these sorts of requests. So any employers who are getting that kind of request, I think can hopefully look at that guidance. And generally, employers can turn down these requests. It's not a right to work flexibly. It's a right to request to work flexibly, and employers can turn it down. But if they wish to do so, then there are 8 prescribed statutory reasons that they can give for refusing. And I'm not going to list them all now, but it's things like an inability to meet to redistribute work amongst existing staff, or an inability to meet customer demand. So it's a sort of operational reason for not being able to accommodate that request. So under the flexible working regime itself, provided you follow the right process and you give one of the set reasons for refusing, there's little scope for employees to complain. But it's not that simple, and there are pitfalls for employers along the way with that as well. In relation to sort of discrimination, key pitfall is that if you just give a sort of knee-jerk refusal and shoehorn your reason into one of these 8 statutory reasons without really thinking about it, and so that your reasons don't actually stack up.
It's not just cut and paste then. You don't think, oh, that's applicable for this particular employee or whatever.
That's exactly right, Louise, because if you do that, the risk is that the employee will say, well, that's just a cut and paste response. and a tribunal just wouldn't like that. Because the risk is somebody with a protected characteristic under the discrimination legislation might say that if you turn it down without a good reason, then that gives me a claim for discrimination. For example, like a woman who makes a request to meet childcare requirements, it's still very much recognised that the women would tend to bear the childcare responsibility over and above men, and therefore if an employee says, no, we need everybody to be here full time from the office, then a woman might say, well, that has a negative impact on women, it's having a negative impact on me, and therefore that's discriminatory, and the employer has to be able to justify that requirement, and they might be able to justify it, but they can't just have a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh no, it doesn't work. They need to be able to show why it doesn't work. And the other drawback, of course, is if you know, I think employers need to think about what kind of employer do they want to be, you know, and if not only because they might risk claims, but also, are you actually going to alienate your staff, your workforce, and are you going to alienate talent? And you know, what does that do to your retention and your attraction rates?
Especially now, you know, when you've got so many people deliberating both on the employee side and the employer. Are we in a state of flux then at the moment? Do you think there's going to be more change or more sort of policy review?
Yeah, I think we are in a state of flux. The pandemic, there was already a move, you know, there's already been people saying that the law doesn't really cut it in this area, and that there needs to, and that employers aren't sort of offering the flexibility that they need. But the pandemic just accelerated that massively, because all of a sudden people were forced to embrace all sorts of working arrangements that people never really thought were possible. For example, you know, employers might have said, God, no, we couldn't have everybody working from home. That would be a nightmare. We could never do that, but we had to.
If only they knew, yeah.
I know, and so they had to. So employees, lots of employees actually had a very good opportunity to really demonstrate that this can work. And so now turning down a request from somebody who can say, well, hang on, I've shown that it's worked for this period of time. How can you refuse that now? It gives them quite a lot of leverage, and it makes it harder for employers to turn stuff down if it's been proven to work. Now, that's not to say it's impossible, because it may well be possible to say, well, you know, we coped, we had to, it was the pandemic, but actually for these reasons, in our business, we need to go back to something different.
Yeah, and to that point, do you think then that we've reached a point where it's critical that employees are aware, and actually are there any tips that you could give people who are currently rethinking their role, or actually feel that they have got a potential case where there's either discrimination, or they've been sidelined, or they actually just want to review the way that they work? What would you advise in a sort of helpful way as a professional, but also the things that you've noticed that people can do?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is, if you're an employee who is contracted to work from the office full time, and you've been thinking for a while, this doesn't really work for me, and I could do with some additional flexibility. If what you're looking for is a permanent change to your working arrangements, you just want to switch to part-time or switch to home working, now is a good time to put in a formal request, because this direction of travel does seem to be towards flexibility. The momentum is with you at the moment, I feel. So now is the good time to do it. If you're going to do it, I think a lot of employers historically have confused sort of full-time equals commitment to the business. And I think now people are realizing that that's not necessarily the case. And you know, the pandemic's kind of enabled everybody to see the kind of more human side of everybody else, I think, and that we're not all just machines that come to work and spit out the output of our work. We're people who have homes and families, and I think perhaps I'd like to think that's been improved during the pandemic. So I think I think, make it clear that you're committed to the business, but I would hope that that falls on more fertile ground at the moment. And then make a business case for what it is that you're asking. When you put forward your request, don't just say, oh, I want to work at this, these hours or whatever, because I think you need to do a bit more than that. You can help yourself by really making a business case. I can make this work because, and preempt what you think they will say are the problems. So for example, if you're proposing a job share, the classic objection to that is, well, how are you going to address that we won't have continuity? And think about that and think, well, in my job, actually, we can get around that by having good handover notes, or by having a day where we do crossover, or whatever it is. Preempt the objections and offer solutions to that. And also think about, maybe accept that your request might not be acceptable in its pure form, and so be perhaps prepared to negotiate. These things are often a meeting of minds and a meeting in the middle. So think about, and that works for employers too. If an employer can't accept a request in its pure form, you're going to be less criticised if you offer some sort of concession or some sort of compromise. So think about compromise. So that deals with people who want to work part-time. If they've requested or want to make a flexible working request, if they've requested and have been turned down, then that's the case of, I think, and really object to that, then that's the case, I think, of seeking some advice on that situation to see if there is any scope to challenge that decision. Right. And there have been people who have won significant amounts of compensation because those sorts of cases haven't been dealt with properly.
And I mean, you mentioned the fact that there's a lot of goodwill throughout the emergency measures, if you like, of the pandemic. But do you envisage that employers could perhaps miss out on some of the potential pitfalls of actually not just reviewing people's contracts, but actually going over and making sure that they don't fall down on things that might be based on assumption? I mean, in your experience, would you have any pointers to employers to say, watch out for these particular occurrences or things that could go wrong?
I think we'll probably come on to sort of more general hybrid working things, I think, in a minute, Louise. But if we're sticking with flexible working for now, the problem is managers or the people that are handling those kind of requests just not seeing the wider picture and just doing that cut and paste job. And actually there are some cases which is probably worth me just mentioning, because I think they do highlight where employers have got it wrong. Because basically these cases, I've got a couple of recent ones that I'm thinking of, which I'll just explain in a moment, but there's not been a change in the law overall. The law on flexible working, the law on sex discrimination or discrimination has been static for quite a long time. But I do think that with this change in employees feeling perhaps more entitled or to that because it's becoming more the norm, employers perhaps embracing it more, I think there is a direction of travel is that the judiciary too seem to be recognising that. So one case, Chloe Daly and BA City Flyer, this was reported in September last year. She was a long-standing member of cabin crew staff. She became pregnant and then she asked to reduce her hours by 25% with set days off in the week. And her request was refused, and she was successful in her claims because although the airline had given reasons, they'd done exactly that. The reasons just didn't stack up. The employer had basically overinflated the objections. They'd sort of said, oh, well, there's this problem, and this problem, but those problems didn't stack up. They weren't problems. They'd been over exaggerated, and the evidence was generalised. And when she'd appealed to a higher level of management, the appeal manager had just sort of rubber stamped the original decision rather than looking at it. So she was unfairly dismissed and discriminated against as a female. So it really shows that thought and transparency is important. And another one, same lines, Thompson and Scan Crown Limited, the claimant in that case got nearly £200,000 worth of compensation because for sex discrimination, because again, tribunal found it was clear that the employer just hadn't taken the request seriously. So I think that reinforces my earlier point that it's okay to, it is, you know, that it is okay to say no to these requests. There will be occasions where it's just not workable, but you know, do think about them and articulate your responses. And when you're writing those from an employer's perspective, when you're writing those letters to say no, think, okay, this might be looked at by this person's solicitor or ultimately by a judge one day. And although those cases, they're just employment tribunal decisions, they're not binding on other courts in the future, because they're not high enough level to create precedent. They do show how these sorts of things are looked at, and I think are useful for employers to know. So managers need to be trained on sort of how to deal with these requests and to think about that.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that something as recent as last September could be influencing people's decisions around what they're going to do this year or next year. And I mean, you mentioned hybrid is an area that is quite interesting because we are in the thick of it. But does hybrid working introduce a whole new realm of employment law then, or is it applying the principles in a new way?
Yeah. So hybrid, before we just to tie up the thing on flexible working, before we move to hybrid, I'm just going to say that the flexible working regime that we've been talking about is under review. The government are looking at, well, they published a consultation document last year called Making Flexible Working the Default, which proposed, it wasn't as radical as the title suggested actually. What it did was propose a number of tweaks to the current legislation, making it a day one right rather than 26-week right, and also take perhaps some tweaks to the 8 reasons that employers can give to say no. That's closed now, so we wait to see if there are going to be tweaks to the legislation. But there are calls from some quarters that the proposed changes just don't go far enough, and that actually what needs to be done is this whole bit of law that around flexible working needs to just be sort of ripped up and start again. And there's a Bar Council working group that has had lots of publicity from the author and Instagrammer Mother Pucker, who's been very vocal in all of this. So there's quite a lot of debate out there about how this particular area of law might change. But you're right to be saying, well, what about how does this all interact with hybrid and what we're seeing kind of more generally? And yeah, what we've talked about so far is when an employee says, hey, can I change my working arrangements? But what we're seeing now is something really quite different, which is where lots of employers are themselves saying, hey, we don't need everybody here all the time. And actually, we could save loads of money by not having people here all the time, because we don't need the big office anymore. We've seen that we can reduce our overheads and our employees can be productive. So yeah, there is a kind of wider shift for sure.
And that means what then? Does it mean that you have to think of hybrid as not just being a waiting room until things change, that hybrid actually is a new form of productivity? You know, we've done a lot of debate on this already about the fact that hybrid is both a tech issue in terms of how do you make it work, but it's also a human issue, isn't it? It's like, it has to consider people's rights, the conditions they work in, but also that business case, the commercial case of actually, is the motivation purely for the employer to save costs and save headcount, or actually is it about doing things better? And without having a strong view on that, do you think that the legal debate is very much about the fairness of hybrid, or is it about the reasons why it makes sense and why it's better for both employee and employer?
I think when it comes to hybrid, the legal position doesn't really drive it. I think the commercial position of what works for an employer will be what drives it, but then making sure that you can do what you want to do from a legal standpoint, if you see what I mean. I think the commercial decisions around what is best for the business will probably come first. And initially, yeah, I think I like what you said about it being a waiting room, because I think up to now it really has been, hasn't it? It's just been like, oh, this is what we've got to do. it was just foisted on everybody. But yeah, the big question is how is that going to continue? And I think, yeah, there's all sorts of things that are sort of not legal things. There's sort of, yeah, the business rationale and the business case and the people issues, exactly that. But ultimately, there are some legal issues that sort of feed into it and that might constrain or shape how you get to what you think is your ideal scenario. I mean, I think, you know, before you get onto the legal issues, there's just questions around, you know, does it work, and are we going to miss out on, you know, the spontaneity, the classic, you know, water cooler moments of you know, sparking ideas when you're just sitting around your colleagues and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And similarly, the issues around sort of you know, junior colleagues learning from senior colleagues, and are we going to lose something there with that? And that will feel different in different businesses, and different businesses will have different ways of trying to deal with that, and also different perceptions of how much of a problem that is in their own working environments.
Yeah, and also that you know, the commutable distance that you can live within if you're working in hybrid or you know, flexible working. There are lots of sort of unturned stones, aren't there, in terms of debate. But what are the main concerns, do you think, that employers should be thinking of? Are there any sort of areas that you think, actually, if I'm going to pinpoint 3 or 4, these are those?
Yeah, sure. So I think first one is beware discrimination. I know we've talked about that in the sort of other context, but when it comes to hybrid and all these different arrangements, think about discrimination. You're going to need to keep a really, from a number of ways, you're going to need to keep a really close eye on the fact that you're not ending up with a kind of two-tier workforce. You've got the people who still come to the office and the people who stay at home, and are we treating those people differently? Because that may well result in discrimination, because if the people that stay at home tend to be older or younger or, you know, female or male or whatever, you know, you could end up with different groups being treated disparately, and that whenever you get different people being treated differently, you could end up with discrimination claims. So making sure that everybody has the same access to training, development, facilities, etc. You know, you just need to be fair. But also, if you're not adopting a kind of single uniform approach, but a kind of letting people ask for home working and sort of saying yes to some people, not saying yes to others, who are you allowing to do this? And are you drawing boundaries between, you know, different age categories or the sexes, and just thinking about that. So discrimination is a key one. And then the other big one is what are you saying in people's contracts? So the place of work is one of the things that you have to specify in a contract, in a statement of terms and conditions. So if as an employer, you're going to take the sort of quite radical decision of saying, okay, look, place of work, we don't have an office anymore, we're shutting that. Your place of work, everybody's place of work is going to be changed to home, then that is going to need to be changed in a contract. And are people going to agree to that? And if they're not going to agree to that, are you going to effectively dismiss and re-engage, or fire and rehire is another way of putting that? Because if you're going to do that and you've got 20 or more staff, you're into opening up all sorts of collective consultation obligations that are, you know, significant, and there are significant penalties for not doing that. So a lot of employers aren't going as radical as, right, okay, we're definitely closing the office and we're going to force everybody to work from home. Many more are, especially for the time being, while we kind of suck it and see and sort of see what happens and see how this pans out, many more are kind of keeping the contracts the same, or just shifting them slightly and maybe saying, look, your place of work is still the office, contractually you're still required to work here, but you may work from home from time to time as agreed by your manager in accordance with our hybrid working policy, and then putting all the rules around all of the stuff about making sure, you know, you're still commutable from the office and that you have the right equipment and everything else are all in a really good policy that you can, you know, shape and mold from time to time. So I think that's probably the way that a lot of employers will end up going, and that seems sensible to me.
Yeah, it sounds very agile, doesn't it? You know, if you're basically saying it's not just work in progress, we've considered it, we've written something down, and now your contract is watertight, but actually by the time the next review in 6 months' time, it could have been adapted, couldn't it? We really are living in that sense of sort of changing organizational structure. I mean, any sort of closing thoughts then? Because I mean, our audience is a mix of entrepreneurs, of consultants, of people who work in large organizations, but also people who are employees. Do you think that the future's bright? Do you think it's going to be less complicated, or do you think things are just going to get more interesting?
I think that the future is bright. I think that I think people's eyes have been opened to all sorts of different ways of working, and that can only be a good thing. So I think we need to see what happens in the next 6-12 months. You know, has this all just been a bit of an experiment and everything will go back to how it was, or is this the start of a permanent change? But I think it probably is. And so yeah, I think it probably is an interesting time, and I think employers could stand to gain massively from that, in that they're going to be tapping into a wider pool of talent. People who maybe thought that they couldn't do certain roles are suddenly realizing that they can do roles, because you know they can be worked in a different way. So I think, you know,
be good. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's got to be good. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
Good. Well, that's good. And I think there's no doubt that you're going to be busy and challenged then in the next 12 months at least. But thank you. You know, we've rattled through so many things, but we will catch up and I'll collate everything into a one-pager, so we aren't just relying on what you've spoken about. I think there are some real insights there, what you've pointed towards. So thanks, Nicola. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank
Brilliant.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much for such a brilliant conversation. Really enjoyed it. And to know we're all ending on a high note, and good to know that it's a positive ending. If anybody that's watching this would like to learn more about the Tech London Advocates Future of Work and the events that we have planned for this year, then please check us out at techlondonadvocates.org.uk, and hope you'll join us. And thank you all for today's great discussion. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Jan. Thank you. Bye, Nicola.
Thank you. Bye.